All right, let's go ahead and get class kicked off here. As always, we will start with any questions. How are we feeling about full stack? Do we have any questions in general? No? Everyone good? All right, I am going to find where in the schedule we worked on the chat app in React. So the good news is we do not need to start from scratch on the front end tonight. So we are going to start out in week 14, day 3. Let me just make sure. Nope, just kidding. We went back to chat and finished it in week 15, day 4. So go head over to week 15, day 4. That was because we did half of the chat app and then I forgot about it, and then we came back and finished it up. So we are going to start with week 15, day 4 as our starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go back to my week 18 folder. I'm going to make a day 2 folder inside of it. Then I am going to paste in my day 4 chat. And I'm realizing I forgot to delete my node modules, so it may take a second longer here. Once it is done copying all of that over, I'm going to rename it as chat-frontend and go ahead and throw that into my VS Code. Then we are going to make a new folder, and we're going to call it chat backend. We are going to pop open a terminal, CD space, don't forget the space, grab our chat backend, go ahead and drag that into the terminal. When we hit enter on that, we can see that we are now in the chat backend folder. We can now run npm init-y, and that is what is going to set this up as a project with node packages built into it. So I'm going to do my npm init-y. Once I've done that, I can close out of my terminal, grab my chat backend, throw that in VS Code. I'm going to get you some live share links. And then the last step that we need to do is create a new file. Let's call it server.js. And we need to fire up these puppies. So I am going to open an integrated terminal. I'm going to do my npm start on my front end. Have that pop open for me where we left off. Then I'm going to do our, we're going to pause there. So you should just have your front end up and running and your server.js created. I'm going to give everyone a breather, make sure you've got all of those up, make sure you've connected to the live share if you would like to connect. If you need me to repeat any step, let me know. Everyone good, or anyone need another minute? Yep. Yes, if you deleted your node modules before you copied the front end folder over into this week's folder, you will want to do an npm install before you do your npm start on the front end. you will get an error message that React scripts is not installed. That should be a sign that you need to do your npm install before you do your npm start.
And are we creating like two files on the backend?
The package.json is generated for you when you run the npm init-y, and then server.js we did create from scratch, and we don't have anything in it yet. Anyone need another minute?
Can you repeat how you create the backend?
Yep, the backend.
Thanks.
You're going to create the chat backend folder manually. You can then pop that folder into your VS Code. You're going to open up the terminal in VS Code, and you're going to run the command npm init-y. That will generate out the package.json file for you. And then we create server.js manually by just creating a new file and calling it server.js.
If you hate yourself, can you just manually build package.json?
You could, yes, it is just a JSON file.
Okay. Didn't know if it was doing anything else.
There is nothing special about it. And if you leave off the -y, it will actually ask you to fill out the fields, so you could name your project and kind of go through that. But the -y is just use all the defaults, basically. Okay, everyone good? All right, couple things that we need to do to set up our server.js. We need to install a couple dependencies. So in the past, we've run npm install for each one of these dependencies, but if we specify a list of all of them, it will allow us to install them in bulk. So what we are going to do is npm install, and we're going to do express, because that's how we build our APIs. It's the framework in Node. Cores, because we want to be able to access this API on different origins. PG, because we know we're going to be interacting with our Postgres database. And now we're going to do one final new one. We're going to do sequelize. And if we hit enter on that, it will think for a second. And I'm going to copy this command into the chat just in case you need it. And if we take a look in our package.json, we should see our dependencies are now installed. So we've got access to all of them without having to manually install them. We're going to make two other changes to our package.json. We're going to add in the start command. And in order to start this up, we are going to npx nodemon. So it knows to monitor our files when they start up. And we're going to change one more thing. It doesn't matter where you add this as long as it's not inside the scripts or the dependencies. So I'm going to add mine right after the scripts. I'm going to set something here. I'm going to say type is module. What that's going to allow us to do is, instead of the common JS way of importing things where we say const express equals require express, instead we're going to be able to use the React style of imports. So we're going to be able to import express from express instead of const express equals require express. So this is just the newer way of doing the imports, but because it's newer, we have to tell Node.js in our package.json, hey, the type that we are doing these imports is going to use the ES6 module method instead of the older common JS method. So we'll see the difference in that in just 1 second. We did cover this in cohort 5. We did not cover this in cohort 4. Okay, so once we save that in, we are now good to get our API server up and running. So I'm going to head over to my server.js, and instead of saying const express equals require, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we can do is say import express from express. Should kind of look similar to the import that we use in React. We're also going to import cores from, you guessed it, cores. And then we need to do some setup here. We copied from week 15, day 4. Yes, week 15, day 4 for the front end. Back end, we started from scratch. Terry, you look confused.
Is it the Star Wars one?
No, it's chat.
Don't think I have that on here.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to send a zip of mine.
Because I only see like two photos, day 1 blog and day 4 Star Wars.
I just sent you a zip of it. So just download that, open it to unzip it, and then you'll need to run npm install, and then your npm start will work. And let's hope that I didn't just break mine. Nope, we're good. Okay. So we've got our import set up. Now we need to get the server all fired up. So we're going to say const server equals express. I can type. We are also going to do our server.get, and it's a good idea to always have an get at the root just so we can test it to make sure it's actually working. So we're going to say that is going to be a rec res. That is going to res.send server is running. Then we are going to server.listen on 3001. And when it is fired up, console log out server is listening for requests. Once we get that done, we should be able to npm start, and you'll notice that your terminal will ask you, hey, do you want to install NodeMon? That's because when we install node dependencies by default, they are project level dependencies. So you'll notice we had to reinstall Express, we had to reinstall cores, we had to go install all those packages again. That is because every project could be using a slightly different version of that package. So that's why it is project specific. That's actually to our benefit. So when it comes in here, when we do our npm start, it's like, whoa, NodeMon, I got to go grab the latest version of that. So when it says OK to proceed, I'm going to type Y and hit enter. It will go ahead and install that. And then it is going to apparently error out. Ah, I think I know why. Yes, okay. In our package.json, I forgot to specify what the name of our file is. So if you have an index.js, it will default to that. But because I called mine server.js, I need to tell NodeMon what file is basically the starting file. So head back to your package.json, add in your server.js is as part of your start script, and then come down to the terminal, and you may need to Control-C to stop it, up enter to restart it, and you should see servers listening for requests. And the last thing you can do to test open up localhost 3001, and you should see your server is running. Again, in your package.json, make sure you add in your server.js as part of the start command. In the terminal, go ahead and do your npm start, and that should fire it up and give you the servers listening for requests. Joe, what's up?
For some reason, maybe it wasn't even running to begin with. I'm getting unknown command nodemon.
Do you have npx in front of nodemon?
npx. Let's see. Nope.
And then you may need to restart it in the terminal. It isn't particularly good at seeing changes. Terry, what's up?
So do I need to for the back end inside the terminal? Do I do npm install pg like?
Yeah,
Or-
so I pasted in the chat at 5:43. I did npm install, and then I listed out all of the different things that I wanted it to install. So that one command is going to install Express Cores, PG, and Sequelize for you.
Gotcha.
Joe, what's up?
I'm getting I hit I changed it to npx and then it said that crash waiting for file changes before starting. Do I need to
Did you add
I
the
just-
server.js to the end of that command?
yeah I'm getting nodemon 3.14 to restart anytime enter rs watching paths, watching extensions, starting node server.js and then type error server.get is not a function. Oh, is there a problem with my actual code then?
So make sure you've got the parentheses after Express right here.
That would be why. All right, server's listening.
And I hijacked the server, thank you. I don't know why anyone doesn't want to just see messages with my mother, but you know what? Okay. All right, anyone else need help? End result here is seeing servers listening for requests here. And if you go to localhost 3001, you should see server running. Keep in mind, this is only the second time we've set up an API server, right? So we've got a couple more projects to get practice with this. And at a certain point, you're going to say, oh, just shut up, let us set up the server ourselves. But going through the steps here, hopefully this will become more of a well-oiled machine as we get more and more practice. Anyone have questions or need help? Tiffany.
Oh, she can go first.
I think mine is crashed. The app is crashed right now.
Okay, share your screen. Okay, so you request remote and NP it should not be npm start. Okay. And it is crashing. Server.length is not a function. That must have been your autocomplete. This should be server.get.
Oh,
And now you're good to go. Of
thanks.
course. Someone else need help?
Yeah, I have the same crash, but I don't know if it's the same error.
Probably not. Let's take a look.
Sure.
You are apparently using the triple S version of Express.
Absolutely.
Good to go. Anyone else need help?
Yeah, am I supposed to be saying pretty dash print with a checkbox next to it on my 3001?
You may, that may be a Chrome extension that you have installed because it's sending back JSON, so that's okay to see. Or Chrome may have finally built that feature in, or whatever browser you're in. So the pretty print options are totally fine.
Oh, it's in white and it is changing it. I see.
All right, anyone else need help? Okay, I would like to tell you we are done with the server setup, but we need to do one more step. We haven't connected to the database yet. We're going to connect to the database a little differently than the way we've done in the past. So this is going to require more upfront setup, but once we do have it all set up, it will make interacting with the database significantly easier. And we're going to see that once we get all of our endpoints set up. But to get through the setup, we're going to make a new folder called DB. DB is obviously short for database, and it is common to group all of that into a folder. We are then going to create a new file inside DB called db.js. Your code will break horribly if you do not have the db.js inside the DB folder. So make sure that when you collapse your DB folder, the db.js file disappears. Now, inside db.js, we've got to do some work. So we're going to import Sequelize from Sequelize without the curly braces. Don't be fooled by that autocomplete. You do not want curly braces in there.
Why?
Because it's complicated. It may actually use the default export and it may work. But my reference code doesn't have them, so we're not going to put them in. I will at the end of class show an example of when we use the curly braces and when we don't use the curly braces as part of an import export. So I will answer that question. Okay. From here, we need to connect to the database. So we're going to say const db is equal to a new Sequelize. And what we're going to do is say, hey, we are going to connect to Postgres. And what Postgres are we going to connect to? We're going to connect to localhost 5432, which is the default port number. And then we need to specify what database we are going to connect to. Well, here's the problem. We don't want to put it in the to-dos database. Where do we want to put it? We want to put it in the new database. Well, we can't do that in our code alone. So we have to fire up Beekeeper Studio. And in Beekeeper Studio, I'm going to connect to my local DB. And it doesn't really matter which one I'm connected to because I'm making a new one. So I'm going to go to a new tab and I'm going to say create database messages. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit the run button. And what you should get is okay. If you run that command, you should get no results, 0 rows affected. That's okay, because if we hit the refresh button up here in the top left and open our dropdown, we can see our messages has been created. So we're going to click into the messages, and because there aren't any folders that we've created in here, I'm sorry, there aren't any tables that we've created in here, it's going to show us this weird stuff that Postgres uses under the hood. That's okay. So as long as you see messages in this dropdown and can switch to it, we're good to go in Beekeeper Studio for now. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. Then I'm going to come back over to my backend code and I'm going to connect to that messages database. Once we do that, I want to kind of test this. I want to know if this is working or not, right? So we're going to create this function called connect to DB. And it's going to be async because the database connection is asynchronous itself. We are then going to do a try catch because oftentimes this will error out. If your database server isn't running, if it can't find the database called messages, if there's something wrong going on here, we want to know about it now as opposed to waiting for a request to come in and then go, oops, we can't find the database. So what we're going to do is we're going to say try. And what are we going to try to do? We are going to await the db.authenticate. And if that works, we're going to console log connected to the database. If that didn't work, we are going to catch the error. We are going to error out the error in the console. And we are going to finally throw one more error in the console that says DB issue, everyone panic. Once we have done all of that, we need to call that connect to DB function. And UPS is dropping off a package, so apologies in advance for my dog losing her mind, if you can hear that. Lay down. Okay, once we have done all of that, I'm going to save, and you see that we get servers listening for requests. And I'm like, okay, but it should be either logging out connected to the database, or we should be seeing DB issue. We're not seeing either one of those. Does anyone have a guess as to why not?
Getting stuck in trying to authenticate.
No, because then we would see this catch and it would log that out. Here's a hint. What have we told NodeMon to do? We've told NodeMon in our package.json, watch server.js. But in server.js, all we did was tell it about Express. We didn't actually set anything up to pull in the database. Well, in order to do that, in our db.js, we need to export the DB. Terry, the only thing we did in Beekeeper was create database messages, and you can run that command in any database.
And you put curlies around the DB and export because it's a JavaScript function?
Would you two stop asking questions that I don't want to answer right now?
Sorry.
So I will answer that one. We put this here because we want to be able to export multiple things out of this function, out of this file. So this isn't the only thing we're going to export here. So I will try and explain this, and if it doesn't click this time, it will click eventually. We could put it like this. If we put it like this, when we import it in our server, we are going to import DB from db.js. Export default db.js. So what that is doing is it's saying, hey, the default thing that's coming out of this file is this DB thing. So now you don't need curly braces to import it over here because it's going to use that default export. What I wanted to do instead, though, was export this as an object. Because if I export it as an object, I can export multiple things within that object. But now my import is mad because it's like, yo, you're giving me an object here. What part of that object do you want? So we have to modify our import here and put it in curly braces here, which makes it happy again. So whatever we do here, we basically have to match over here. If this isn't in curlies, it doesn't have to be in curlies over here, but because we want to export multiple things, we preemptively put it in curlies here and then match that over here. I still like Austin's answer the best because I said so. Okay. Paul's point, we should see connected to the database here. And we see something a little funky. It says select 1 + 1 as result. That's actually what the authenticate method is doing under the hood. It's saying, hey, if I can get in the database and tell the database to select the numbers 1 + 1, and I can see that the result is 2, I've successfully authenticated to the database. I'm good to go. So in your console, you should see connected to database. This is a lot of this file that we've got to get set up. And we do have to remember to have this import in our server.js, because by default, this file won't run until we have it imported in our server.js. What's your crash, Austin?
I imported everything in server.js and I went and it saved and now it's saying it's not. It said it crashed, waiting for files to change.
Go ahead, share your screen. I see no problem here. You are using the snake version, apparently, not the elephant version of Postgres in your db.js. Line 3, Postgres only has, well, one S at the end.
Oh, okay.
Save, and you're good to go.
Yep.
Anyone else? Do I need to make a table or anything in the database? Yeah, there won't be a public folder yet. We're going to create the table another way. Terry, you need help? Okay, I'm going to pop in here. Okay, this is a good error for everyone to see. You see how it says cannot use import statement out of a module here? It is mad that we're using the newer import syntax here. So you want to be careful. The way that we tell it, hey, we want to use the newer import syntax instead of the older one, is in our package.json. We add another thing in here, and the order doesn't matter as long as it's out in the root level. And we say the type is going to be module. And that's what allows us to use that import syntax. Now, we fix that, so that's good, but we have a different error. And this is what it looks like when we can't connect to the database. It says connection refused error. And then down at the bottom, it says unable to connect to DB. So at least we know our try catch is working. Over here, we are going to create the the database called messages. And when we run that, we can now refresh up here and see our messages is now created. So if we come back over here and reboot the server, it continues to give me an error because 5432. And now we are connected and good to go.
Thanks.
And this is totally normal, by the way, for this stage, like to have all of these little hiccups. Hopefully you guys are all paying attention, because one day you'll run into an error that someone else has run into and be like, oh, I know how to fix that. Tiffany, I'm coming to you next. The only thing that we did in Beekeeper was create database messages. And if you refresh in the top left drop down, we can see that messages is part of that list. It's not showing in mine because I'm currently in it, but it should be as part of the drop down. Okay, Tiffany, you're up. Okay. Messages. Okay. I don't see any problems, so I'm gonna check in Beekeeper. I'm gonna refresh, and it doesn't look like the database got created. So I think what happened is you typed this in, but you didn't actually run the command yet. So if we run it, now we can see it as part of the dropdown, and we can Control C to stop. Ooh. Ooh. Why won't that stop? I'm gonna just close it and restart it here. And you're good to go.
Just a side tangent real quick. What are the differences between all the different terminals? There's just said bash, I think, then switch to node. And there's other ones that are like ZSH.
Yeah, ZSH is the new default for Mac. It's an upgrade over Bash. It's a little bit newer. I've only ever used the defaults. So I don't really know the differences between them. I do know at work our DevOps person is about to throw the laptop through the window because we are forced to use Windows to deploy to AWS. As part of a contract, and he is going absolutely insane because all of the commands that you know for like cd and make dir and all of that kind of stuff are totally different on Windows command prompt. And Windows command prompt is so bad that Microsoft came out with another scripting language called PowerShell because their terminal sucked so much. So fortunately, Mac uses the shell and bash by default, and now ZSH, which is an evolution on bash. And that is all in the Linux family of styles of terminals. But I am certainly far from an expert in terminals to be able to answer that question. Okay, anyone else need help? Anyone not have connected to the database rocking in their terminal down here?
I can't get the database figured out. I'm
Okay,
struggling. to keep it.
share your screen. Ew. No, no, no. Something has gone horribly wrong.
No, I know.
Abort mission, abort. We're gonna close out a Beekeeper. I think what happened is you somehow connected to something other than Postgres. So instead of going into demo database, we're going to go into local DB instead. And that's what's taking us into Postgres with 5432. So if I connect there, okay, This is another good one. The connection is refused. If anyone ever gets a connection refused, whether it's in Beekeeper or in your code, it could be that Postgres itself isn't running. So if we pop open search and do a search for
My search either. Hang on. I'll get you the other one.
yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay, it is running. So why can't we connect to it? Localhost, name spelled right. Okay, so just opening this was enough to get it running. So now we can close that or minimize it. It will run in the background. Because of that, we can now go into a new query and say create database messages and run that. Son of a, why is that not running in the background? Okay, we're gonna just minimize it and then run the command. Okay, now that's working. Is your Postgres app in the applications folder? Like when you installed it, did you drag it into applications?
Unsure. I'm still not really sure how installing things works on the Mac.
Aha, I have found your problem. So if I go to, I'm gonna close this. And then I'm gonna go to your downloads. And I'm gonna pop open Postgres here. And this is a good note for anyone. Whenever it has this like arrow over, they want you to take it here and drag it on top of applications over here. Once that is done, you can go to applications, find Postgres. And now when you pop it open, it is running and we can kind of close it. And because it is now happily in your applications folder, you'll see it's actually still running in the background. So the Mac is totally dumb because it's got like 3 ways of installing something. And no developer agrees which way is best. But if you ever do see an interface that looks like this, they want you to drag and drop it and then open it from the applications folder. Now that we're doing it from the applications folder, it is happily running in the background, and we can go to the back end, reboot, and get connected.
Thank you.
Of course. Terry, what's up?
Besides creating files for the front end, did we do anything else? Did we add anything else for the like just the front end part?
We haven't
Oh.
touched anything on the front end yet other than just getting it up and running.
Okay. I just had to make sure.
Yep, nope, totally fine. Austin, don't get me wrong. I love Mac too. Windows is a complete shit show. One of the only 2 things that Windows does better is installing applications because there's only one way to do it. And the reason why they're better at it is because there was no way to package an application into one file. And so Windows was like, no, you got to install it. You got to have this like complicated installer that does all the other files. And the Mac team was like, or you could just put it in one special folder and then you can just open it and run it from there, which was a great idea in the 80s when they came up with that. Not such a great idea now when there are all kinds of permission issues and security and gatekeeper and just, but you know, we make decisions and then have to pay the consequences for those decisions sometimes. And install was a fallout of that. The second thing that Windows does better is window snapping by default, but thank God they're updating that in the new version of Mac OS, and I won't have to bitch about that anymore.
It's coming.
Yes, I am a fanboy. Yes, I watch every WWDC. I just mark them as holy events in my calendar, and people know not to bother me during that time. Okay, any other questions? Everyone connected to the database? Cool. I know this is rough now. I promise you this does get better. We get through those steps. Okay, we've connected to the database, but we haven't done anything with the database yet. What we need to do is tell Sequelize what the model of the database will be. That model is kind of like the table schema. So instead of having to manually go into SQL and type in create table messages and think through the form field or the columns that the messages are going to have, we're going to instead tell Sequelize what that model looks like, what that table looks like. The really cool thing is once we tell Sequelize what the table should look like, it can create the table for us. And for the really cool part, it will write the SQL to do selects, inserts, updates, deletes, and the table creation itself. So let's see how we do that. In my DB folder, I'm going to create.
Can I please ask a question before you continue? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I had some water boil and I had to get it. Okay, so Sequelize is like a package or a framework from, does it come from NodeMon or is it something separate?
Separate from NodeMon, it is a package, and the type of the package it is an ORM, an object relational mapper. So break
Okay.
all three of those down because that's, I say ORM and people are like, okay, yeah, whatever. But if you think about it, object, we've seen objects before, right? We know key values, we know how they work. We know that's JavaScript's data type. We know relational because SQL is a relational database, right? So we're taking an object and we're putting it into a relational query, and then the M is the mapper. What is mapping from an object to the relational query or from the relational query to an object.
Okay. And that is what allows us to connect to our database.
Sequelize is allowing us to connect to our database instead of going through PG directly. We've added like a middle layer between that. So Sequelize is going to do a better job of allowing us to write a query in JavaScript and have it mapped into SQL. It's going to SQLize our JavaScript.
And will that prevent us having to do like the backticks and the queries? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Step ahead.
Oh.
But in order for us not to do the backticks, it needs to know what the table should look like. And so that's the extra step that we have to do here. We can't just select star from messages. We need to tell it, hey, the messages table is going to have a couple pieces of information in it, and then it will use that model to do all of the SQL mapping or translating for us. Step ahead of me, let's set up that model. So in my db.js folder, I'm going to right click on that and create a new file. And I am going to call this message.js. In my message.js, we need to import, and we're not doing the default import here. We're not pulling in all of Sequelize. We are pulling in a section of what Sequelize exports out for us. So we do need the curly braces here, and we're going to pull in data types. And now I'm curious. Okay, never mind. Went down a rabbit hole. We're not going to do that. So we're going to import data types from Sequelize. Now we need to tell it what our model will look like. So we're going to say, hey, there's going to be a const message. And the message needs access to the DB. Once we are in there, we are going to return the DB definition. We're going to define what a message looks like. This is going to be our table name. We then need to give it a couple more pieces of information. So, in the second parameter, we pass an object. An ID is always the hardest one. So follow along for just a second. We're going to say ID has a type of data types dot integer. It also is the primary key, and it will auto increment. ID is the trickiest one, a lot to do there, but hopefully all three of those make sense. That's kind of the shortcut we do in Postgres, is we set it to a serial column type, and it did the auto increment for us. Because SQLize supports more than just Postgres, we need to tell it, hey, not only is it an integer, but it's a primary key and it's going to auto increment for us. So little work we have to do to get that working. We then need to think about, all right, well, what are the other data fields that are going to be in our table? Well, for that, we can actually go look, because in our front end, in our app.js, we already have something that's doing a lot of this heavy lifting for us. We already have the text, whether or not it's outgoing, and the timestamp of when it's sent. Okay, well, let's work with that. I mean, if it worked over here, it's probably going to work over here. So we're going to add in the text, and that's going to be a data type of text, because that text could be more than 255 characters. So whenever we are working with under 255 characters or under, we're going to do a string data type. But anytime the user could input more than 255 characters, we're going to do the text data type. The string is what SQLize calls a varchar. Okay, we also need to add in whether or not it's an outgoing message, which is going to be a data type .boolean. And we need to add in the timestamp, which is going to be a data type of date. Date defaults to date and time. Date only is obviously just the date. Time only, oddly, doesn't exist. Databases don't like storing time if they don't know what date that time is on. Hopefully none of you run into that problem, though. Okay, so we have our ID, our text, our outgoing, our timestamp in. There are two things I got to do to make SQLize actually kick in and work with this file. The first thing I want to do, make sure this is saved. Sorry, three things. 2.5. I need to export the default message here. Because there is nothing else coming out of this file, because I know there will be nothing else coming out of this file, I say this is the default export, right? When you import something from this file, just assume that it's going to be that message. Then over in my db.js, I'm going to do this in a separate window. No, I'm not. Okay, screw it. In my db.js, I'm going to import my message model from message. Capital M here, because it's a capital M over in this file name, and I probably need a .js on that. I do. Now that I have imported it, I need to give the message model access to the database that we created right here. So the way I do that is I say const message is equal to the message model that gets the database. And finally, I want to export out the message down here that we gave access to the database from up here. Believe it or not, people don't agree on how to set up SQLize. This is the easiest way I have found to set it up. But once you get used to this flow, it becomes much easier to interact with it. It is not a requirement that your capstone uses SQLize. So if what was making sense to you after we do SQLize 2 more times in different projects, if PG makes more sense to you than SQLize, it is totally fine to use PG in your capstone. But once you get through the weird setup of Sequelize, you will probably fall in love with it and only want to work with that. May not feel it right now, but a little bit more practice may get it there. Okay, the last thing we need to do, we gave it access to the database. We've got the model all set up. The last thing we need to do is say, hey, after you have authenticated, after you've connected to the database, go ahead and sync the database based off of our models. And once we do that, we get a bunch of crap in the terminal. Kind of interesting. And one of them is a statement that says create table if not exists. Huh. Create the messages table. Use that ID and make it serial. Oh, wait, we saw that, right? When we created that table for the to-dos project. Also set up the text as text, the outgoing as a Boolean, and a timestamp as well. We also got two additional things in here. We got created at and updated at. Those are just defaults that Sequelize throws in for us. It is possible to turn those off, but for now, we'll leave them in there. Well, wait a second. If it can write all of that SQL for me, and I told it to connect to the database, if I go over to Beekeeper, I can find this hidden refresh button under entities, and holy crap, it created the table for me.
I got a
Wrong.
question. Oh,
Joe, go first, and then we'll go around from there.
You just hit the refresh button.
This refresh button is hidden. So you have to hover over entities, and that gives you the refresh button you need to hit.
It keeps pulling up a loading bar that's like flashing really quick and then going away, but I don't see anything in there. What if I
Do
refresh
you
it?
see all of the SQL in your backend terminal?
Yeah, create table if not exists, messages, ID, serial, text, outgoing, boolean. Yeah, seems so.
All right, share your screen. Um, you forgot to tell it to connect to the
Oh.
messages database up here.
A
Proof that it can be done by someone other than me. All right, who else needs help or has a question?
I got a question. Where
Yeah.
you get message model from? I looked at message.js, but I didn't see it. Am I missing it?
Yeah, because it's the default export here, we can call it whatever we want when we import it.
Is that because there's only one thing being exported?
Because there's only being one thing exported and we specify it as the default, we can call it whatever we want over here.
Oh, okay. I understand. Default. There's no other option. This is just the
Correct.
thing.
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason we have to do that is there is a difference between the message model here and the model after it's been connected to the database. And so if we just called it message here, it would be like, well, what is it after it's got the database information? So naming convention for me, I say, hey, it's the message model. And then after it gets access to the database, it becomes the message itself.
And you mean message, I mean, you mean model specifically like template or something like that. Like this is
Yeah.
the model of our messages.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
So
I'm
for
still getting used to naming conventions.
every table that we create will have its own model. The model is the model for the table, the template for the table, and that's how Sequelize knows how to translate between the object and the query.
But is that standard? Do people throw like model at the end to mean what you mean?
Yeah, yes.
You've seen it.
So, like I said, there is some debate of how to set up Sequelize efficiently. So some people will have the DB folder and then they'll have models as another folder inside of it. Some people will put message model at the end of every file name. Some people are really weird in how they import their model and give it access to the database. So if you look at Sequelize's documentation, they don't really make it clear how to import and export with different files. So they're like, oh, just define this model, right? Which is along the lines of what we just did. And then they're like, well, just use that user. And I'm like, yeah, but we're going to have multiple files in our backend, right? Like, doesn't it make sense to make the message model its own file and then be able to get access to it? Well, it does, but they don't really show us how to do that import export flow here. So I have to look this up every single time I either start a new Sequelize project or teach this class, because once you get it set up, it becomes really easy. Create the model file, import it in db.js, export it, and then you can use it. And we haven't done the actual using of it yet. All we did was the syncing of it over. But this flow tends to be the one that has made the most sense to me, and I've seen other students click with, which is basically make the model, tell the database about the model, then use the result of that, the database knowing about the model, to actually write queries against.
So Sequelize is telling you just to like define the database model in whatever, like the server.js. That's how it thinks it the right way is to do it. And we're just making a component out of the model so we can call it multiple places. Is that the difference?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Terry, go ahead. Or is that an old message? We already fixed your problem.
Yeah, I already like fixed it.
Sorry. Whenever I share my screen again, Zoom loves to close the chat and then there's no sound effect so that there's a new message posted and it drives me nuts. All right, anyone else not see their messages table in Beekeeper? All right, let's go do attendance before we do the final step here of actually writing our first query to pull that data in and out. Tonight's secret word is model, M-O-D-E-L. Yes, M-O-D-E-L.
I actually don't see message on my Beekeeper.
Are you in the messages database in the top left dropdown?
Yes.
Did you hit the super secret hidden refresh button under entities? Or to the right of the word entities?
I did not. Oh, I see now.
Gotta love those super secret refresh buttons. There are literally 3 icons there. Why can't they make those 3 icons show all the time? There's already a refresh button up here. Just make that show all the time. It's okay. I love Beekeeper. Beekeeper's great. Okay. We've done the work. We're seeing the promise here, right? Of it's creating the table for us. Wouldn't it be cool if it could also write the query for us? Well, we don't really have any data in messages. So sometimes it makes sense to start with a read operation in the database. Other times it makes sense to start with a write or an insert, right? Create command. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to go to our server.js. And between my get and my listen, I'm going to say server.host, host a message in. It's going to be an async rec res because everything in a endpoint is a rec res. And from there, we are going to say, hey, go await a message. And notice when I type in message, auto import's got 2 things working for me here. It says, do you want to go to the message that is exported from db message.js, or do you want the message coming out of db /db.js? I want the second one. I want to get access to the message that is coming out of the database that has access to the database. If I did this, this is the model file that does not have access to the database yet. So we need the one flowing through db.js because that's the one that's connected, that's synced in, that everything is connected that we can work with. So up at the top here, you'll see we now have import db and message. That's why we put it in those curly braces, because we needed access to more than one thing coming out of this file. So in our server.js, we do have our db. We also have our message here. Our message here, we can now run a command on called create. And what are we going to create? I'm going to just pass it the entire rec.body. And then I am going to res.send back just an empty thing. So I go ahead and save that. Now we got to test it. So backend endpoint, where do we normally call our backend endpoints? Well, oftentimes if we don't have a front end built, we go into Postman and we use Postman to send in that data. And that's how we can test our APIs that we're building without having a front end. But in this case, we do have a front end. So I'm going to go over to my app.js and I'm going to go find where we send a message. So in my message input file, I'm going to pop that open. And there's this function called send message in here. So I'm going to come right underneath this event prevent default. And I am going to say, hey, I'm going to const get a response. And in order to get that response, I need to await a fetch. And now await is mad at me because we can't use await without async. So I need to come up to my send message and async that right there. Now that I've asynced it, I am going to go to my local host 3001, and I am going to go to the message endpoint. I need to tell it that the method that we're sending in the data is going to be a post. I need to tell it that I am going to send in a content type of application JSON. And I'm going to send in a stringified body. Once we do all of that, now I got to figure out what's going into my body. Hopefully not fast food. Just kidding. We need to send in whatever fields I set up here. So the text that I'm going to send in is my inputted message. Where's that coming from? That's coming from my state up here. We also need to send in whether or not this is an outgoing message. Well, because I'm sending the message, it is outgoing. So I'm going to tell it outgoing is true. And the last thing we need to do is send in a timestamp. So I'm going to send in the timestamp as a new date. Obviously a lot of code there, so giving you guys a second. Everything is in that send message function in message input. We're just working on the response and the fetch. If you try this, it will error out. There are two more things we need to configure, but I'm going to give you guys a second to get this code in.
You said it's supposed to be erroring out?
Yes. Well,
And
it's supposed to be erroring out if you've tried it in the browser to send a message. It should not be erroring out in your terminal.
oh, mine crashed. Let me see if I can figure it out.
Yeah, your terminal should, it will have like a warning. It says response is assigned a value, but never used, but it should not crash it entirely.
Oh, my backend's crashed. So let me see if what the reason for that is.
Well, I just realized when I was writing, I put all the code like before the event prevent default. Yeah.
So you can just take this line and move it back up between the send message and the event prevent, basically here. So it should be send message, inside send message is the prevent default, then the fetch, and then the update message is underneath it.
Will it like mess up if I like leave it the way it is?
It depends how long your fetch takes. So if that fetch is running in the background and we're waiting a long time for that fetch to run, it will not prevent the default quick enough. And because of that, the whole page will refresh. So yes, it could cause problems if you don't move it up. But if your fetch is fast enough, it could be in the window that the prevent default still works. Joe.
I keep getting NodeMon app crash, waiting for file changes before starting. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I think it's an issue with the import from message.
Okay, go ahead, share your screen.
Right, miss an S somewhere.
Import message oh, you know what it probably is? It is in db.js. Once we get the message here, we've got to export it from this file.
Oh.
So that we can import it from the other one. And now you're good to go.
Oh, I guess that makes sense because it's looking in the db.js file.
Yeah, we're basically flowing it through db.js.
What's the reasoning by calling them at the same time from DB instead of calling it? Is it because what's being processed in db.js
is different than the model itself? Yeah, gotcha. We want basically what the model is returning after it has connected to the database. Anyone else need help? There's like a police chase going on outside my window, and I've never heard this much traffic. Nice.
Is the application JSON is coming from the package JSON in the backend?
App. What do you mean application JSON?
With the header.
Oh, what we're doing here is I'm not showing my screen. We're telling the server heads up the data type of the body is JSON. Because there's more than one way, more than one content type that we can put in the body. So by specifying that in the headers, we're telling the Express server, hey, in order to know how to get the body, I'm going to tell you on the front end that the body is using a content type of JSON. Something's not connecting. So this body doesn't have to be JSON. We could send an image in that body if we were uploading a file to our backend. When Express gets the body, it's like, dude, what is this? What did you send me in the body? I don't understand. So in the headers, in the front end, we say, hey, when I send this data to the back end, it is going to be JSON, but I'm going to tell the server I am sending JSON so that when the server gets it, it can look at the body and go, oh, because you told me this content type is JSON, I know how to extract that data out and work with it.
So we just sending, so we're sending that JSON to the server?
This data is in JSON,
Mhm.
and this is telling the server the type of the body is JSON.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we could specify like, oh, we're sending you a JPEG here and put the JPEG right in the body. So that's what we're doing by putting this in here. We're saying the content type of the body itself is JSON.
Okay. Gotcha.
Okay.
I was kind of confused because I'm thinking like, okay, I'm thinking like, oh, are we like sending like the package JSON from the backend to like the server? Okay.
Nope, nope, nope. All we're doing is we're saying this data that we're sending itself is JSON. Okay. We got to fix two things though. If I go to my front end and pop open the console and type in a message and hit send, I get a failed to fetch right away. And this isn't particularly helpful until we scroll up and see access to fetch at 3001 is blocked by CORS. Like, mother, what do you mean it's blocked by CORS? In my server.js, I imported CORS right here. You notice though that that's grayed out. Just because we import it isn't enough. We need to tell the server to use that CORS package that we just installed. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm like, all right, should be good now. I'm going to come back over here. It still has a failed to fetch because the server rebooted. We fixed that error. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page. I'm going to type in test and hit send. And I'm like, okay, that looks good. And I'm going to pop this open. Oh, messages in the chat. I will answer both of those questions in a second. And if I look in, that shouldn't have worked. Okay, it did not work. So at first glance, I'm looking at this and I'm looking and if I look closely, it says insert into messages. And it's got all of those columns listed out. And I'm like, okay, kind of interesting. I come over here and I look in my database and I got null, null, null. And then the created add and updated add. Like, okay, not great. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to throw in a console.log rec.body. And I'm going to try it again. So I go into my Chrome and I type in ABC and I hit send. And I look at my database again and I get another null, null. And I'm like, well, that's not great. But I'm going to look over here and I got an undefined. Why is my body undefined? We told the front end stringify this data, put it in the body. We told the front end, hey, tell the back end that we are sending in application JSON. What did we not do? Parse, yes. Where do we parse? In the back end, yes. 50-50 shot of that one. In the server.post, no, because it's already undefined here. So if it were defined as a string, then we'd be able to parse it. We need to come up here and tell the server we are going to use JSON, which is coming from Express itself. Now the server has woken up and has gone, oh, if you tell me the content type is application JSON, I know to use this, what is called a middleware, and parse it out. So if I save this and send in a final message and hit send, you'll notice we've got suddenly a body. And inside that body, we've got some data. So if we go to our beekeeper and refresh the table down in the bottom right, check out what is now in our database. Okay, so two good questions. What's the significance of application here? Why do we say application / JSON? There is a accepted list of MIME types, which is short for multi-purpose internet mail extensions. It was basically the precursor to kind of file extensions. I dropped the link in the chat. So there is a entire list that is maintained by the IANA, who is a big standards body. And you can see that they have like the file extension, and then they also have like the full text version of it, basically. And so you can see like image / JPEG is one of them, text / CSS, which we use as the rel tag, I believe. Couple big ones in here, but application JSON you can see is listed as that, so that's why we use the MIME type there. Both the front end and back end agree on this list, and that's how they know what the list basically is. And then the other question was, how does the front end know which back end to connect to? It's done by port number. So because we said 3001 here, it is going to be listening on 3001 right here. So that's how the front end knows to talk to the back end. The other thing is we said localhost here, which is saying send it to another port on this computer. Localhost is basically saying the same thing as 127.0.0.1, which is known as the loop back IP address. Basically, send the traffic to this computer. However, when Nathan comes back in 3 weeks, he's going to teach you guys how to deploy. And when you deploy, you're going to set up your backend on a different domain name. So you're going to learn how to modify a DNS record, tie it to an A record, set up your API's domain name, and then modify your front end to go out to a production internet server instead of your local computer. Very complicated answer to basically just say localhost means on this computer, 3001 means, go to port 3001, and then we tell it 3001 over here. So it is entirely possible to be running multiple backends and multiple front ends and multiple servers, but they can't be overlapping on the port. Only one port per application. Front end, back end, whatever kind of server it is. Okay. Did anyone not get this row showing in the database?
I did not.
Okay.
1 second.
let's go on break because it is 7 o'clock and we'll pick up with anyone who needs help debugging afterwards. So go on break, be back at 7:25. Did anyone need help getting their message in the database? Did anyone not have their form submission end up working? Everyone good? Okay. So, a couple things we got to clean up here. One, I've got these two nulls hanging out in the database, and that's going to just cause problems for us down the road, right? Because we don't want messages stored in the database that are completely empty. We're going to have weird parsing errors. It's not going to know how to show the message, going to get really funky. So we don't want that. So I'm going to actually repurpose one of them. The first one, I'm going to click into the text and say example incoming message. I am going to set outgoing to false, and I'm going to come into the timestamp here, and we haven't seen this before. I'm going to set that equal to now with parentheses at the opening and closing. Those parentheses tell SQL, hey, I want to drop in the current timestamp. I just go ahead and set in whatever the time is when this executes. I am also going to right click on a row and hit delete row. Now, a reminder that this SQL hasn't actually run yet. We're basically building up the query in Beekeeper, but we haven't told it to execute that query yet. So in order to make it do that, I need to come down to this apply button. And when I click apply on that, you will see it has deleted out the row for me and has updated the values, including the timestamp. So got my database cleared out. I've updated one row, so outgoing is false. I've added text to it. I've got the timestamp loaded in. And then I have also deleted out a row that was all nulls. If you have multiple nulls, go ahead and delete out those rows so we only have the content that we actually care about in there. Okay, so I have saved that. My database is looking good. I come over here and I refresh, and I see hello world first message responding to hello out there. Well, that's not what I have in my database. What do I have in my database? The only thing that I have in my database right now is the data that I am sending in. Well, I need to be able to get all of that data out as well, and I need the front end to request it. So I'm going to say server.get. No. Go get the messages. It's going to be an async recres because we are working with the database. And we are going to res.send back the messages and check out how easy it is to write this statement. All we need to do is say await message.find all. And just like that, we have written a SQL query that is going to go into the database and get all the messages out without us having to do any additional work. We don't have to select from tables. We don't have to get the rows back out. All we have to do is server.get messages, tell it, hey, go to the message model, go find all of them, and send it back. And just in that one line of code, it's going to send that information to the front end. Once we have that in there, we need to switch over to the front end, and I'm going to go up to my app.js, and in my app.js, I don't have a use effect. So I am going to come down after my use state. I'm going to say use effect, and I'm going to say, hey, when the component first loads, so don't forget that empty array at the bottom. It's going to prevent any issues. We are going to make a thing called const make API call, which will be async. We're going to make the API call so it actually executes. And then in our async, we're going to say, hey, the response is going to come from an await of the fetch to localhost 3001. And we're going to get the messages. Because it is a GET request, we don't need to specify that in the front end. It will default to using GET. And we don't need a body or the headers because we're not sending in any JSON and we're not specifying that what we're sending in is JSON. So we can get away from saying, hey, the data is coming from a weight of the response.json. And finally, we are going to set our messages from our data.messages. And I'm going to peek, and we run into a problem. We do have a runtime error. We're going to fix that in a second, but we're going to start with it here. And I'm going to throw in a console log data.messages. So I've got our server.get here and our use effect over here. So 24 through 32 and 13 through 15 in the backend. And if it is working, you will actually have an error in the backend that says toLocale time string is not a function.
What changes have we made since break?
The 13 to 15 in the backend and 24 through 32 in the front end.
For some reason I'm not getting an error.
You may not have worked, you may not have put the timestamp in for your messages. Do you see the message content in your front end that's in your database?
Oh, now I don't. No, I just have the message itself.
You want to share your screen?
Sure. All right. So it's just working in here, right? So just this.
Yep.
And then just this.
Yep. And see it in the browser.
Oh, all right, whatever.
Bye, Felicia. All right. Anyone need to give you guys one more minute here? Okay, so we've got a problem. It says props message to single timestamp to locale time string is not a function. And I'm like, oh God, like where am I going to trace all of that down? Well, we could use the global search tool over here, right? We could go find the instances of to locale time string and figure out what's going on. But if I throw just this console log data.messages in here, I'm able to see that my ID looks right, my text looks right, but my timestamp is a string. And I'm like, well, strings don't have a function to locale time string built into them, but dates do. So the problem that we're running into here is even though that we have told our database model that we're pulling out a date, it turns out that JSON doesn't have the ability to send dates. JSON or JavaScript object notation supports strings, booleans, and null. It does not support sending times over the internet. So what it does instead is it drops it in this format. Well, we need some way to convert this timestamp into an actual date. We can't do it on the back end though, because if we do it in the back end, JSON still has the same problem. It doesn't know how to send that date over the front end because JSON doesn't support it. So in here, instead of just setting the messages to data.messages, we're going to map over the message. We are going to get access to each individual message, and we are going to return the message as it is, but for the timestamp, we're going to make that out of a new date using the message dot timestamp. Okay, that's some voodoo. We have surpassed entry level JavaScript. We are now leveling up our data game here. We're saying, hey, before you set the messages into state, go get the messages from the data, loop over them. That will give us access to each individual message. After we loop over each individual message, what do we want to return out? We want to return out a new object that has the existing object copied into it. All of the data that was in that original object, spread it out into this new one, but override the timestamp, and in the timestamp, make the timestamp out of a new date. That's the pro level way of doing it. This slightly easier way of doing it is wrapping our props, right? Wherever we call that to locale time string, just putting new date right in front of it. That would also solve the problem. But this is basically saying before we put the data into state, map over it, grab the timestamp, throw that in there, and we're good to go.
Good question.
Shoot.
Again, going off of the spread operator, because that's making a copy and throwing it into a new object.
It is taking the original object and spreading it out into a new object.
So how does, when you target message.timestamp, how does it know whether to target the original or the new
It will
spread
target the
object?
original because this is not a named variable. This is. So this message and this message are both referencing this message up here.
So why are we putting it into a new object then if we're not going to use it? Or am I misunderstanding something here?
The object that gets returned out of here is what generates the data.messages array that ultimately gets set into state.
Oh, you're just making a temporary copy, right? And then
Correct.
so you can,
And
I
then
got
setting
you.
that into the state. Yes.
I see.
Yeah, we could be explicit with that. We could do something. You can follow this if you want to, or leave it as is. You could say const messages with formatted date is equal to this map, and then set that in to the state. That would achieve the same exact thing. Okay, we got our timestamps working. Kind of weird that this is actually after this one because we sent this message in and then we added this one into the database. But we are in pretty good shape here. Now I can send a new message, hit enter, have it show up, but I can also refresh the page and look at what's staying there now. We didn't have to link this to local storage, and I could actually send you guys a link to this and you could see the messages in my database. And that's the whole magic of databases, right? Is we have that persistence in here. So we can close it, come back to it on an entirely separate computer and still see that because we have one backend and one database. And no matter how many front ends there are, because they're all connecting to that API, and because that API is going to that one database, our data is finally persistent. Does anyone not have messages being able to send and showing up when we refresh the page? And remember to open the chat. me some head turning. Does anyone need help or another minute?
What should be the expected output?
We can send messages, and if you refresh the page, you can also see all the messages in the database.
I'm getting an error, but I was gonna try to debug it.
Up to you.
Did you make the example incoming message right in the database, or does that is that pulled in incoming messages?
Say that again.
Is that what is it? Example incoming message? I don't know what you had in the UI. Could you just go back to that real quick?
In here?
No, your yeah, example. Where did the example incoming message come from? Did you manually set that somewhere?
Yeah, in Beekeeper. I just
Oh, you just made a
edited the
new one?
text.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to reply to that.
Yes, you
Ah.
do have to apply it in the bottom right.
Gotcha.
All right, Terry. Share your screen. Let's take a look together. I can feel the strain in your neck from so much back and forth that, you know, I just gotta save you. All right, I'm gonna request remote. Messages, JSON, data messages, map. Spread out the individual message. So if you put messages here, you're confusing it because it doesn't know where, or we want to loop over each individual message. So we use the individual message here and here. And that should, if you test in your browser, see if that fixes it. Cool. Okay, anyone else need help?
Why is my outgoing showing? I have one that's at 7:43:15. That's after my 7:43:22.
Yeah, because we didn't sort by timestamp, it defaults by sort by ID.
Even if I added it beforehand. Oh, does it change when I edit it?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, Terry.
Yeah, like the only reason why you like see me turn my head like this because I got like 3 monitors. So I got this monitor right here from the Zoom, this monitor for the live share, and the other one is for like my Mac. So
Oh, I've got 3 myself. I totally get it. That's the so in earlier cohorts, I would poll like 40 times in a class of like, all right, let me know when you guys are done, right? And I would throw up a new poll. And then I just realized if you guys have your video on, I can tell because we give you a second monitor now. So if you keep on going like this, right? Like that's why you keep on seeing the bottom of my head. My code's down here, my camera's up here, my reference code is over here. So if you guys think I'm doing this all from memory, you're crazy. I've got it from last cohort and I'm just going off that. I can probably do 90% of class from not, not looking at the reference code, but every now and then, like the interview class, it was like I got out of class and messaged my boss and I'm like, man, I hope you never fire me because I'm never passing a technical interview. I was like, that was a rough class.
Seems like there's no hope for us then, huh?
I got through it. I got to the end answer, didn't I? Okay. So let's get an update query working as well. So I would like to be able to click on a message, be able to update it, and then have that data save into the database. So I'm going to head to my outgoing message because we shouldn't be able to edit an incoming message. And I'm going to say on click of this call 10, edit message. Now, of course, we have to tell it how to edit the message. So we're going to say const edit message is going to be an async function. And we are going to say the new message text is equal to a window.prompt that asks the user what is the new message content. And just to make sure that's working, I'm going to console log out the new message text. From there, I'm going to click on my message and I get my little pop-up and I can say blah and hit OK and see blah comes out of the console. So now that I got blah coming out of the console, I need to then send that to the backend. So I'm going to say const response equals await a fetch to localhost 3001. And we will send it to edit message. Inside here, we are going to include the new message text as, or you know what, sorry, did that wrong. The method will be a put. The headers will be the content type of application JSON. And obviously, feel free to copy and paste this if you would prefer to do that. The body is going to be a stringify of the new message text. But we do run into one other problem here. We know the new message text of what we want to set it to. What we also need to tell the backend is what message are we trying to update. We could do it based off of the old message text, but then that gets really messy. What if the person has sent that message more than once and that's saved in the database? So whenever we can, we're going to try and base all of our updates and deletes off of the ID. Well, I don't think we use the ID anywhere in this component yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just console log out the props here. And if I log out the props, I can see that I have this thing called message to single. And inside my message to single, I've got my ID of 3. So I'm going to also send in the ID, which is from my props message to single ID. And I'm going to just comment out our props. I'm going to save. And of course, all of this is just going to work and the database is going to be magic. And no, just kidding. We made this endpoint called edit message. Or we're trying to call this endpoint called edit message, and we haven't made that endpoint yet. So we got to go back over to our backend. We got to pop into the server.js. We're going to come down and we're going to say server.put. And we're going to call it edit message. We're going to get our async rec res. And here's kind of the cool thing. We'll do a res.send before we forget. And what we can do in here is we can say const message to edit equals await, go to message, and find 1, where the ID lines up to the rec.body.id. Well, that seems a lot more succinct than select star from messages where ID equals something. Let's see what comes out of that. I'm going to just console log my message to edit. So everything is in this const edit message. Hopefully we're seeing some repetition here of seeing the fetch, the content types, the methods, the body, the stringify, the data that we want to send in, and then being able to access that data in the request over here. So to test this, I'm going to go to the browser, I'm going to click on a message, I'm going to type in ABC, hit OK. And then in my backend terminal, I'm going to take a look. And this is what comes out, which is kind of interesting. It says, here are the data values, and here are these previous data values. Kind of weird, right? Like, should only have one data values. And then this unique number is the ID, and it's keeping track of some weird stuff under the hood. It's keeping track of what's changed in some options, if it's a new record. Kind of funky, right? Well, check out what we can do. Because Sequelize is powering this object, Sequelize is able to keep track of what has changed on that object. So what we are able to do is come in here and say, hey, I'm going to set my message to edit. I'm going to edit the text inside of that message. I did call it text, right? Yes. And I'm going to set the text equal to our rec.body.new message text. But remember in Beekeeper, when we made an edit, what do we have to do? We had to hit the apply button, right? We had to say, go execute this, go save it in. We need to do the same here. So we're going to say, await the message to edit, save that sucker in the database. I will run through this in 1 second. Let's see if it works, and then I'll do a review of all of this. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to click on final message. I'm going to type in ABC. I'm going to hit OK. Nothing has appeared to work, but if we check our backend, we do see this update query. Peculiar. If we go to Beekeeper and refresh our table, we see our text is updated. And if we go back to our front end and refresh the page, ABC is now down at the bottom, but it did save the ABC in. So we've got some bugs to fix there. But if you click on a outgoing message, you should be able to type something in, hit the OK button, refresh the page, and see whatever you type in show up. Let's do a recap of that. We did an on-click edit message of our outgoing message. We then came up here and said to edit the message, prompt the user for whatever the new thing is that they're typing in and store it in new message text. Then make a put request to edit message and include the new message text coming from the window.prompt, and also send in the ID because we need to know what ID we are editing. Now we switch over to the backend. So we go to the backend, we go to edit message, and we go, in order to update the message, we need to find which one we are editing. So we say go to message from the database and find an ID that lines up with the ID in the body. The ID in the body was coming from the props over here. So we come in here and we say, hey, now that we found the message to edit, set that text equal to whatever the new message text is getting sent in the body. Again, coming from here, which is coming from our window.prompt. Once we update that, we have to tell the database, save that new updated information into the database. So we call message to edit.save, and that's what actually executes our update statement down here. Then we just send back, hey, we've received your request. We're sending you a response. It is pulling ID from, prepare for the trickle down here because it's a very long trickle. We start all the way up in app.js. App.js gets the messages from the database, sets it into messages. Messages goes into messages in state, which goes into messages to list, which goes to the messages list component. The messages list component gets messages to list, loops over each individual one to get each individual message. This happens to be an outgoing message, so take the individual message and send it into message to single. Message to single is in outside outgoing message, is getting message to single here and accessing the ID from it. Do you want to regret asking that question now?
All I gotta say is thank God we named it all those things the way we did.
Or you could have followed my naming convention where we just called it message at every single level. I saw your question. I went, oh God, I got to go through all of that.
I was like, where is it pulling ID from? And then, yeah, I figured that's what the answer was going to be, though. It was just somewhere very far away.
Doing, 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 prop, component prop.
Now, is this an instance in when you would want to use, well, no, because you wouldn't have mapped over it yet. I was going to say if this was an instance, you'd want to use the context API, but
It could be. Yes, if your data was sitting all the way up in app and you didn't want to go through 3 or 4 prop levels, you could store that data in context and then pull it out, or store it in a provider and pull that out without having to pass the prop down at all of those levels.
right, but you'd have to map over it in app.js, right? To get the individual message. Because that's how you'd be able to find the ID for it, right?
You would you have to do a map somewhere. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let's fix a couple behaviors and then we can do a review of all of this code. So again, what should be happening is we should be able to click on a message, type something new in, and when we hit OK, it doesn't change yet. But if we hit the refresh button, we do see that it changes. Why did it wipe out that? That was funky. No idea why it did that. So a couple things we got to fix. If I edit this message now and say 1, 2, 3 and refresh, 1, 2, 3 is now down at the bottom. So by default, we're getting a weird sort order going on here. So we can fix that by going into our backend. And when we get all of our messages, we can specify a sort. And the way we do that is by cheating and going to the documentation and doing a search for sort, because I don't remember off the top of my head, and that's not in my reference code. Okay, in here, we say the we throw this in an object and we say the order that it should appear is based off of the timestamp. No, we don't. We say order must be a type of array. Order by the timestamp. Okay, now we get 1, 2, 3, D, E, F. If I go in and change my 1, 2, 3 to my 4, 5, 6 and refresh the. Come on. Okay, D, E, F, 4, 5, 6 becomes A, B, C. Refresh. Okay, that appears to be working. So we specify order here, and now the messages, no matter what ID is getting edited, no matter what the updated times are, we see that the order is applied through that timestamp property. So that's one fix. That's going to prevent things from shuffling around. The other thing that we run into, though, is that when we edit our message here, the problem is that the updated message is not reflecting in state. The problem that we have, though, is the state is stored all the way up here in set messages. If we go down to the messages list, we don't have access to that set property. So we would need to take our set messages and say, hey, the messages list needs to get access to set messages. Then we need to go into our messages list and up here, get access to set messages and pass that down into our outgoing set messages. And finally, in our outgoing message, we are able to set messages by accessing the props and setting in the data that we are going to get from awaiting the response JSON and sending in the data dot messages.
You
And
go
we
over
are
that
going,
one more time.
yeah, I'll do a run through all of that. And we need to also send in the messages from our backend. Okay, let me run through that one more time. We got to get it all the way down the chain. So we start in app.js. We have set messages up here. We need to get access to that all the way down in the message that we're editing. So we have set messages. We go into our messages list and we pass in set messages into set messages. Then we go into messages list. And the whole chain that I'm going through of the files is up here. We say in messages list, we now have access to set messages. We go down to our outgoing message and give outgoing message access to set messages. In outgoing message, we have access to the props here. So what we do is we say in the props, set the messages coming all the way down through the app.js file to the data.messages. The problem is we also have to tell our backend, hey, send back the messages by finding all of the messages. If we got all of that working, I can go back to my app, I can refresh, I can pick ABC, I can set it to new content and hit the OK button. And motherfucker. We get an error message. Because we have to borrow the motherfucking. I didn't like my solution halfway into it, but I had already committed to it and couldn't come out of the tailspin. Um, Stand by. Don't follow me yet. I think I have a solution, but I'm not in love with it. Okay, sorry. Abandon ship. We're going to do the props passing a little differently. I have realized that I have this thing called make API call in my use effect. And it just so happens that this make API call is doing exactly what I want it to. It is going to get the messages, it's doing the format of the timestamp, and it's setting it into state. Wouldn't it be cool if we could just tell it to make this API call all the way down at the outgoing message? That's what we are going to want it to do. So I'm going to take my make API call outside of my use effect and put it right above it. I still am calling make API call in my use effect because I still want that use effect to run when the page first opens. But I'm going to put my make API call function itself outside of the use effect. So I'm going to pause there because I don't want to lose you guys down the chain here. So in app.js, we're taking the const make API call, moving it outside of the use effect, and the only thing staying inside the use effect is the actual make API call function call.
You're trying to
Once
allow
we-
access for all the components to be able to call that function.
That we are moving it outside of the use effect so we can pass that down through a prop.
Gotcha.
Once we move it outside of the make the use effect, we have access to that make API call. We're going to go down to the messages list and we're going to give it access to make API call. Once we have make API call on our messages list, we are going to go into the messages list. You can command click on the name of it. And we are going to change our set messages to make API call. In our messages list, once we have make API call up here in the props, we're going to go down to our outgoing message, and we're going to change this to make API call and make API call. Once we have make API call in place, in messages list in both the top props and in outgoing message itself, we can go all the way into outgoing message. And after we do the fetch with the ID and the new message text, we are going to props.make API call. So after this is done, after we update the data in the database, we are telling make API call all the way up at our app level to go get the messages and set them into state. So if I come over here and I send a new message and hit send, I get a new message. And if I click on it and say a really new message and hit OK, why is my edit call failing half the time? It's
Mine's doing a weird clicky thing where it'll only select when it's in the middle of the screen. Maybe it's the HTML.
I did that on click on the column. Message to single. Use the ID. New message. Is ID 5. Edit message. It's sending ID 5 and it updated the right one. So we go 1, 2, 3. Edit message. ID 4. But it updated 1, 2, 3. Oh, you know what it is? Yeah. Sorry. We need to specify the where object here. This is the problem when you use Mongo at work and SQL when you're teaching. In your server.put edit message, your find one here, you have to wrap the ID rec.body ID inside an object that has the where key inside of it. Now, our editing is working consistently. So add in your edit message, make sure your find one has this where key in front of it. That's where we're going to stop for the evening. So just to recap, in app.js, we have access to make API call. We send that all the way down with these props. We send it into messages list. We get it. We send it into outgoing message. Outgoing message gets access to those props here. We make our edit request here, and then we tell it to make the API call. That API call down at the grandchild level goes up to messages list. Messages list goes up to app. App has the make API call in it, runs that query, goes to the backend, gets all the new messages, sets them into the state, and we're able to see the edited messages. Sorry, I know it went off the rails a little bit here. I forgot the where query here, so it was just picking a random message to edit. It was not consistently editing the one message that we wanted it to edit. So if everything is working for you, you should be able to click on any message, type something new in, hit the OK button, and see it reflect the new message content. I will spend the next 15 minutes helping you guys get to that point, or if you want to bail now, we will start class helping you guys catch up to this point as well. Whoever raises their hand first gets first dibs. I've inspired so much confidence in you guys that you're like, nope, I'll just fix it myself.
I went through and manually edited all the text fields in my database, and then instead of hitting apply, I hit refresh.
Been there, done that. If you are able to get your code editing and you can actually edit a message, you are good to go for the night. Have an awesome evening.
It would make sense if we can't, but we shouldn't be able to edit the incoming message, right?
Correct. You should
Okay.
not be able to edit an incoming message. You're good to go, Austin. You got your no problem figured out.
Yeah, I was just trying to follow along, and then you went and switched stuff, and once you switched it back, we're good.
Lovely. Need help,
So
Terry?
yeah, so the message that I find all is finding all everything from
The entire database.
okay. And it's gonna order by the timestamp.
Correct. Joe, would you like to retract your Kronk meme once I go off the rails in the
I
last
mean-
5 minutes of class?
I mean, technically, it is all coming together.
You know what it is? I normally don't do Sequelize until the third project, which is the blog project. So the reference code I was using was actually on blog. It wasn't on chat. So I normally do chat with PG directly, and then I go, oh, this is how you do it in Sequelize so that you can compare the two. That one where query screwed everything up where it was randomly updating another one. And I forgot because when you use Mongo to query the database, you don't put the where in. You just use like whatever you're trying to filter by. But in Sequelize, if you're doing a where query, you have to wrap it in the where object. And that's where I just lost it.
Yeah, oddly enough, that part I was able to follow pretty clearly. The rest of it, there's just so much going on and like stuff being passed through. I think I just need to sit and review the code and maybe do some smaller tests with working with Sequelize or something where it's not.
Yeah, and we'll do a review of it. We'll start out tomorrow's class by numbering out all of this code, so that, you know, it's a good starting point before we instead of doing the blog and doing it all over again, we want to like take that breather and go, all right, let's make sure we get this and wring out all the knowledge that we can before we go to something else.
Yeah, I think I'm all. What's the expected output here? I can send a message.
Click on
can
it to edit it, type in new text, hit OK, and see the new text.
And it should be sorted by its timestamp.
Correct.
Cool. Cool. What is that?
Oh, source tree? I've been doing this every night to push my code.
Is that like GitHub Desktop but better?
Not shitty? Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't put my finger on what exactly it is because I'm not skilled enough.
It's
But-
very limiting. GitHub Desktop gives you like you can only commit and you can only push, and that is it. Right? And that is good for beginners, but there is an entire world of Git that GitHub Desktop doesn't let you do. And for me, did not get Git, suffered through an entire summer's internship with it, and just fought it tooth and nail. And someone was like, well, you're doing it from the terminal. Try and do it through source tree. And I did it through source tree, and it like light bulb moment for me, right? Of like, oh, if I'm checking the file, I'm adding it, I'm staging it. And then when I'm committing it, I'm taking my staged files and saying, no, this is now in the repository. And then when I am pushing, I'm taking what is on my local repository and pushing it up to the cloud. And then I'm like, okay, and pooling is doing that thing in reverse to make sure there are no changes. And then branching is just saying, all right, I'm going to go work on this new feature. I'm going to go branch out. And when I'm ready to take that branch and put it back into the repository in the main section of it, I'm going to merge that branch back in. And when I was able to do that visually by like clicking instead of typing in the commands, all of a sudden I got Git and I was like, why does anyone use a terminal for this? It makes no sense. What's really interesting is Ryan has had the opposite experience where he's gone to teach Git to someone and they're like, don't get it. I don't understand what's going on in this UI. And he's taught them the command line and they're like, oh, I get it. You have to stage it and then you do that through adding and then you commit what you've staged. And that makes more sense to them because it's more step by step, not click here, here, and here. So
Yeah, that part's not too bad for me. I just sometimes GitHub desktop acts a little weird with locating. I mean, I was having issues with mine, I
Right.
think, aside from GitHub desktop, but where it's having issues locating the repository or something's not getting cloned down correctly.
source tree will do that as well, right? Because all source tree and GitHub are really keeping track of is like the path to the repo locally. But source tree doesn't get weird about it, right? Like source tree, I feel like GitHub makes it weird to switch between repos compared to source tree, which is like, here's a bookmark to your repos.
It does. God forbid I open something in GitHub desktop and then I don't remember what order this has to happen. I push it, I commit it and push it up. The code is still open in VS Code, so it's still connected to the repo, and I open a new repo. And then it's like, what files are you trying to edit right now?
Yeah, source tree just lets you have multiple windows open, which can be really helpful if you're working on the front end and back end and want to review your code before you commit it. So I really like source tree, but it is a little bit more advanced than GitHub, which can be a blessing and a curse, which is why we don't use it out of the gate.
Right.
But it's free. It's by Atlassian, who makes Jira and Trello. Now they bought Trello.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that they bought GitHub.
So they run Bitbucket, which is a competitor to GitHub. But SourceTree works with GitLab, GitHub, and Bitbucket.
Who owns? Did you say Atlassian owns GitHub?
No. Microsoft
Oh.
owns GitHub. Atlassian owns Jira, Trello, and Bitbucket.
Yeah, I think I'm getting it. Conceptually, it's making more sense the more the project's coming together, and like I'm not thinking. I tend to spin my wheels once I'm thinking about something in the abstract, like fetch or async and await. Async and await really did it, where I was like, I'm not really understanding. Like I know what's happening at the very base level, but what's happening on like the mid to high levels.
Yeah. You can definitely do it in a use effect. You can also do it in a component did update. I've never used a use layout effect hook, but I've heard of it, so I'm going to say all of the above.
It's
Yeah,
a side effect.
yeah, I'm kind of confused with this.
So a side effect is saying when a variable updates, what should happen. So the way you can do that, a component did update, we don't use anymore because we don't use class-based components. And I'm just gonna, because we're still recording, if anyone is like, what the fuck is he talking about? The question is how do you perform its side effects after a component renders in React? And so we don't use component did update anymore because that only works for class-based React components. And we use functional, the whole community switched over to functional. Every now and then you may find older React code that's still class-based. But that's the only reason we don't do component did update. Use layout effect. I haven't personally used it, so I can't show an example of that. But I can show an example of a side effect in the use effect. So if I am, what I can do is I can say, hey, I'm going to use effect and I'm going to alert new message sent when the messages array changes.
And
Messages in state.
does state management work differently in class-based React?
Yes. Everything is
okay.
different in class-based React. Everything. The only thing that's not the same is whatever returns out of the. No, there's a render function. Everything is different in class-based
Right, you have to
React.
be more explicit in your instructions, right? Kind of like similar to lower level programming.
Yeah. And so what this will do is we've added messages in state as a dependency of this hook. So basically, whenever messages in states gets updated, it will alert out new message sent. And so I can be in here and type in ABC and hit send, and you'll see new message sent pops up. So if we leave the dependency array empty, it will only run on first
On
render, on first
right.
mount. But if you put dependencies in there, this effect hook will run. And that's what really the effect is, right? If this changes, the effect of it changing is to run this function in here.
I have a question. Let me see if I can find something. Can you find something in the code using state real quick?
I mean,
if we
messages in
still-
state.
Something based off an input that's setting it to
Yeah,
setting it in
that's
state using the input.
message input here, inputted message set, and then that's linked to the text input down here.
Yes, okay. Value equals inputted message. What is that actually? For some reason that trips me up because in my mind we're saying to have of what's inside the input box, make that equal to something that we should not be mutating.
We aren't mutating it, we're setting it. So we don't say inputted message equals event target value. We use the set function, which is what triggers the re-render. So inputted message starts out as an empty string. So there's nothing in the input, everyone's fine. We come down here and we say, hey, when that changes, the browser is going to trigger an event. The event has a value, which is the letter A that we typed in. Take the letter A and set it into the inputted message. That in turn now updates inputted message to a string with the letter A. The letter A then comes down and re-renders the value with the letter A in it.
That makes sense. I thought it was happening in the reverse order, where it was reading the value line before it was reading the event line.
Well, it does technically, right, to show the empty string or to show the initial value.
Right.
But then, yes, every time we type, it is going through what we call a queue stack or an event stack and chaining all of those state updates. And it does that so quickly that even as we're typing multiple letters, it's just re-rendering that part of the DOM very quickly.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, when I type the letter A, it's going to read that restore it as it's in the input field
Yep.
and then store it again so I can access it elsewhere in the code?
So all it's doing is overriding whatever was in inputted message with whatever the new event target value is. And whenever we do a set on state, if that state variable is used in the return, it will automatically cause that to re-render with the new value in it.
Okay. Alrighty.
Which seems super complicated. And when I was learning React, it was class-based. So like the component life cycles, I thought it was simpler. And then I taught functional React to people, and they're like, no, that makes more sense to me. Because there's a whole in class-based there's a whole
I think that way might click with me more if
Yeah,
it's being more
so
explicit.
this is a class-based React component. And so basically you set up this .state as part of the constructor, and the constructor runs before the component even renders for the first time. And so this is how you set initial state in a class-based component. And then what you do is there is a universal method called set state that gets inherited from the component that it's extending. And so when you call set state, it takes whatever the new value is here and sets it in. And because you're calling set state, it triggers the re-render of the return.
Right, and in the button on click, this dot handle click increment count equals this dot state dot count,
Right.
which is
So normally you would
from-
just pass in, I don't know why they did previous state here. Well, I kind of do, but normally you would just do this dot set state curly braces and say count : count plus plus.
right.
Or yeah, that would work.
Yeah,
then-
this I think this way makes more sense in my brain.
There's the whole component life cycle, which is basically saying every time it re-renders, it's going to do this get derived state from props, and then it goes down to the component did mount. There's a component will mount, and then there's a should component update where you can basically say if I set state and there's some manual reason why I don't want it to re-render, you can return false there. And then there's component will update, which I just mentioned, and component did update, where you can get into it even more. Very, very few times in my career have I had to dive into the component lifecycle to optimize it. So this is kind of a rabbit hole. And this is certainly outdated, right? Because with hooks, the entire component lifecycle has now changed. And you manage a lot of that with a use effect or the use layout effect method that they created to deal with a use case that the class-based component lifecycle could do, but the effect-based could not.
Yeah, that part's fine with reading. Right, I think what happens after it renders again, but I think just setting state. might
If
be
you think
easier
of
for
it
me to
as setting
understand.
state just triggers the re-render, which will have the new value in it, that's all it's really doing.
Gotcha. Alrighty.
Oh,
hop
I
off.
didn't see. How do you optimize a large list in React for performance? That one I would have gotten. So the second question is basically saying, let's say that you've got 1 million rows in your database. The database has no problem showing all 1 million rows and dealing with that data, filtering through it. Databases are optimized for that, right? What React is really good at is updating the data on the screen that's visible on the screen. But when you give React a million things and you say, show all a million of these, React can get overloaded because it's like, whoa, I'm used to dealing with 20, 30 things on the screen at once, not a million things. And so React Window and React Virtualize basically says only render this part of the list if the user is scrolled into it. Otherwise, all that other data, the user can't even see it. They're not scrolled to that section of it. So tell React, don't really worry about it. You can keep track of the data, but you don't actually have to worry about re-rendering it or anyone interacting with it because the user isn't scrolled into that section of the data. And so normally we would solve that with pagination, which is basically saying only show 20 things at a time. And if the user hits the next button, then go get the next 20 from that. The high-tech solution to that is we'll go load the million things, but use a library in React to tell it only care about the section that we've scrolled into.
I was just gonna ask if that's where pagination came from.
Yeah.
So would it be kind of like limit by like with
Limit and offset are what pagination would use to say only show 20 at a time. And then if they click on page 2, offset it by 20. They're on page 3, offset it by 40, right? That is not what the question is asking, though. That is what pagination solves this problem a different way. Pagination solves the problem by saying only give React 20 things at a time to worry about. The libraries do that, but instead of saying only worry about these 20 things at a time, it says only worry about the section of this data that we have scrolled into view. And anything outside of that, we're still going to know what that data is, but we're not going to worry about rendering it to the end user.
Well, that's how Facebook would load your entire feed, right? Or even or something like YouTube or any kind of other aggregator.
Yeah, that's actually somewhat of a hybrid between this answer and pagination, because what they're going to do is they're going to say when you get to, well, yeah, no, you're right, it is.
yeah, thanks, Max.
How you do it on the back end gets a little fuzzy, and then how you trigger it of saying, oh, we're scrolled to like 3 posts from the bottom, so go ahead and load that data in. That's how you get endless scrolling, right? Where you can just keep going and it keeps unloading more stuff. But yeah, those are good questions. All right, have an awesome night. I will see you guys tomorrow.
Night, Max.